أعزائي المشاهدين، أهلا وسهلا بكم في هذا اللقاء الخاص مع سعادة السفير بول بريمر. دخل التاريخ لتوليه حكم العراق البلد العربي العريق بعد غزوه واحتلاله من قبل الولايات المتحدة بذريعة واهية ثبت بطلانها، وهي امتلاك أسلحة الدمار الشامل. واقترن اسم السيد بريمر بالاحتلال أكثر ممن اتخذ قرار الغزو. منتقديه يحملونه أوزار كل ما لحق بالعراق من دمار وفوضى وفساد وانقسام طائفي وعرقي، يشيرون بأصابع الاتهام لاتخاذه قراري حل الجيش العراقي وما سمي باجتثاث البعث، كونهما أخطر الأخطاء الاستراتيجية التي ارتكبها الاحتلال. رد على هذه الاتهامات في كتابه بعنوان عام أمضيته في العراق، وكذلك المقابلات الصحفية القليلة. السفير بريمر يلقي اللوم على القيادة السياسية والعسكرية التي خططت للغزو في واشنطن، وخاصة لأنها لم ترسل القوات اللازمة والعدد الكافي لحفظ الأمن والاستقرار. قبل تعيينه حاكما للعراق بتاريخ 6 مايو أيار 2003 كان متقاعدا من السلك الدبلوماسي بعد 23 عاما من الخدمة، لكنه لم يخدم في أي بلد عربي، وعمل في الاستشارات لشركة أسسها وزير الخارجية السابق هنري كيسنجر، وكذلك كبير مستشاري الرئيس ريغان والخارجية لشؤون مكافحة الإرهاب. أهلا وسهلا بك سعادة السفير.
شكرا.
سعادة السفير، شغلت منصب مدير سلطة التحالف المؤقتة لنحو 14 شهرا بعد غزو العراق. ضمن نطاق مهامك كان يتعين عليك مواجهة القوى التي قاومت الاحتلال، المنظمات الإرهابية، عدد من الجماعات السياسية المتنافسة هناك. ونحن الآن بعد 10 سنوات منذ بدء الغزو العراق لا يزال يعاني العراق مرحلة قاسية من عدم استتباب الأمن، من الاحتجاجات المدنية. فالحكومات العراقية المتعاقبة شقت طريقها بصعوبة لمعالجة تلك المسألة. والآن بعد انقضاء كل تلك المدة، هل تعتقد أنه من المنصف تحميلك شخصيا وسلطة التحالف المؤقتة مسؤولية ما يجري؟
Look, the American government as the occupying power basically faced 3 problems. We had a political problem of trying to introduce representative government. We had to try to begin reviving the Iraqi economy, which was in a desperate shape, and we had to provide security. The way the government was organized, the CPA that I was in charge of was responsible for the first 2 areas, political and economic development. The military, under our system, always under civilian control. The military was a different chain of command. I had no authority over the military. And as you mentioned in your introduction, I pointed out in my book that I raised concerns right from the start that we had not had sufficient security forces in Iraq to provide security for the Iraqi people. And that colored both the political and economic sides as well. Obviously, it was a challenge. Now, I take responsibility for the CPA's actions, which involved the political and economic. I did not have responsibility for the military part, so I have to say that that was the responsibility of people in Washington.
سعادة السفير، في الشهور الأولى لسيطرة السلطة المؤقتة قمت ببلورة نظام حكم جديد للعراق، مجلس الحكم، الذي مثل المكونات الطائفية والعرقية كما عرفتها ذلك آنذاك. ما هو مبرر إنشاء مجلس الحكم بهذه الصيغة؟ وهل تعتقد أنه زرع عمليا بذور ثمار العنف الطائفي في العراق؟
Well, I've heard the argument that the way it was constructed exacerbated sectarian disputes. Why did we do it that way? Well, effectively what happened was we had told the Iraqi people that they would have a representative government. And that means there has to be some relationship between the structure and the population base. Now, nobody knew what the population of Iraq was. There had not been a census since 1957. But the Shia insisted right from the start that whatever government we put together the governing council. They had to be a majority. Once the Shia made that statement, effectively it set in train the Sunnis saying, well, if the Shia are going to have a majority, we represent 40% of the population. We have to have 40% of the seats. Then the Kurds said, no, but we're 25% of the population. We have to have 25%. So once the Shia insisted on a majority, there really was no other way to put together a governing council than by listening to the various groups. We didn't like it. I wrote in my book that we didn't think this was a wise way to go about it, but we really had no choice at that point. Nobody has ever come up with a convincing alternative that was available in May of 2003. And in fact, if you spin the clock forward to a year later, when the UN helped put together the first sovereign government, Lakhdar Brahimi was very frank. He said, I can't figure out a better way to do this than to build on what you already have done. Did it contribute to the sectarian divide in Iraq? It may well have done that. It certainly is a sad thing to watch and see people consider themselves not as Iraqis but as Shia or as Sunnis or as Kurds or as Christians or as Turkmen. And I used to say to the Iraqis when I met them, it's a happy day for me when someone introduces himself to me as an Iraqi, not as a Shia or a Sunni or a Kurd.
أليس ذلك أيضا من مسؤولية الذين خططوا لغزو العراق؟ بمعنى أنه إذا كان هناك بعد إزاحة النظام السابق لا يوجد أي تصور وتخيل للمرحلة القادمة، وبالتالي تقر الآن أنه لم يقدم لك أحد أي اقتراح. ألم يطرح هذا السؤال إذا تم تغيير النظام ماذا سيحصل في العراق؟
The pre-war planning, I was not involved. I was, as you mentioned, a businessman. The pre-war planning was based on the assumptions, all planning is based on assumptions, that the situation after Saddam fell would look much like the situation after we defeated Saddam in 1991 in the first Gulf War. We would face large-scale destruction of the oil industry. There would be huge refugee movements. There would be humanitarian concerns. The planning, in other words, was based on assumptions that actually turned out to be wrong. I don't blame the planners. You have to start somewhere. So the pre-war planning on the civilian side actually did not fit the situation on the ground. The pre-war military planning also did not fit the situation on the ground. You can always say that planners should have done better. That's probably true. Since I wasn't involved in that, I don't have any particular insights except to say that the job I faced was to look at the reality of the situation on the ground, whether it was political or economic or security, and do the best I could, make my recommendations to the President.
كيف يمكن أن يكون جزء من أهداف غزو العراق بناء نموذج ديمقراطي وألا يكون هناك تصور لإقامة ديمقراطية حقيقية، ونحن ننظر الآن بعد 10 سنوات وبعد تجربتك شخصيا كيف تنظر إلى هذه المسألة؟ أنه هل يمكن بالفعل أن يتم خلق نموذج ديمقراطي بالطريقة التي تم فيها حكم العراق وتكريس المذهبية والطائفية والعرقية؟
Well, first of all, let's step back and look at the reality. Iraq is a functioning democracy. They've had 5 elections since the CPA left, which is more than most of the countries in the region. They have a constitution which, despite its flaws, is the most progressive constitution of any Arab country that I'm aware of. And while the democracy has had a lot of flaws, and I have concerns about the direction of the politics in Iraq, we need to keep those things in mind. Secondly, the economy has been a tremendous success. Now, there's lots of corruption, absolutely. And one of the things that concerns me about the present government there is they have tended to try to undo some of the institutions we put in place to try to control corruption. But it is still a functioning democracy, so it isn't a theoretical question, can there be a democracy in Iraq? There is a democracy in Iraq. Can the democracy be better? Absolutely.
تعرضت سعادة السفير لانتقادات شديدة بوصفك من أصدر قرارين خطيرين مباشرة بعد الغزو، تسريح الجيش العراقي أو حل الجيش العراقي، والثاني اجتثاث البعث. ما هي المسوغات التي أدت بك للتوصل لاتخاذ القرارين؟ هل هذه القرارات كانت قراراتك شخصيا أو بناء على توصية مساعديك، أم أن مثل هذه القرارات تم اتخاذها في واشنطن؟
Well, let's take them one at a time. On debathification, the decision on debathification was made in Washington before I was back in government, and it was based on the discussions that the State Department had with Iraqis, a study called the Future of Iraq study, done by the State Department in 2002 and 2003, which concluded, all of the Iraqis they spoke to, that there could be no place in a free Iraq for the Ba'ath Party. It had been the political instrument of Saddam's control, and it was hated. And in fact, again, before I came in government, General Franks, who was in charge of the military operation, had already outlawed the Ba'ath Party. It was already illegal by the time I came back into government. The U.S. government then addressed itself to the question, what do we do about Ba'ath Party members? If the party is illegal, what do we do about all the members? There were estimated to be some 20 or 30,000 members, senior members of the party. So we were talking about 1% of the party members, the top ones. And the government, again, before I came in back, decided that they would issue a decree, which I did issue in my responsibility, that said these top members of the party, this top 1%, can no longer be members of government. They can go off and be journalists, they can set up companies, they can be farmers, but they can't be in the government. So it was drafted as a very narrow decree addressed basically to the top members of the party. It was, I believe, like the correct thing to do. There's no question that some form of debathification was going to happen, and the mistake I made, which I have said again, it's in my book, was I turned the implementation of this very narrow decree over to Iraqi politicians. That was a mistake, because the politicians then tried to use it for their own purposes. What I should have done, and I readily say in retrospect I know that now, is I should have gotten a group of respected Iraqi judges or lawyers, because they have a high position in the social structure of Iraq. I should have gotten a group of judges and lawyers together to implement the policy instead of having the Iraqi politicians do it. And that caused a lot of problems.
ماذا عن موضوع حل الجيش العراقي؟ نحن نشهد الآن وضع أن معظم الذين تم تسريحهم من الجيش كانوا من الطبيعي أن ينضموا إلى المقاومة، وأن ليس لديهم خيار آخر، وبالتالي أحد أعمدة استقرار الدولة والحفاظ عليها تم إلغاؤه. وبالتالي ألم يكن، وأنت تحدثت كثيرا في كتابك وأحيانا حول صعوبة إعادة بناء قوات الأمن والجيش في العراق، وبالتالي بدأ هذا القرار أيضا قرارا خاطئا بكل معنى الكلمة، أن يتم إلغاء الجيش النظامي العراقي كليا. كان يمكن إعادة بناءه وإبقاؤه كما هو. فلماذا تم ذلك، وما هو رؤيتك لهذا القرار؟
The fact was there was no Iraqi army in place by the time I arrived. According to the military, there was not a single Iraqi unit standing to arms anywhere in the country. What had happened? Well, what happened was when the army enlisted men, the draftees, who were almost all Shia, there were about 315,000 enlisted men, when they saw that which way the war was going, they deserted. They went home. They took their rifles and they went back to their farms and their villages and their houses. And as that process happened, as the army disintegrated effectively, they also tore down all the barracks. They destroyed all of the bases. So not only was there no army, there was no place to put an army. The discussion in Washington after the fall of Baghdad, again, before I came in government, was what do we do? Do we try to recall the army, or do we rebuild an army? So those were the two choices that we faced. The advisors I had recommended to me, and I recommended to the president, and he agreed, that we should rebuild the army, not recall the army. Why? There were practical reasons and political reasons not to recall the army. The practical reasons started with this question: was the vast majority of the enlisted men were Shia. The vast majority of the officer class were Sunnis, either Arabs or Kurds, most of them Arabs. It was a brutal army, and the Shia who had gone home, the enlisted men who'd gone home, were not going to come back into the same army under the same officers. So recalling them would have meant sending American soldiers, and we didn't have enough American soldiers to do the job already that I wanted them to do. The looting was going on in Baghdad. We had no control over the borders. We would have had to take American soldiers, send them into the villages and farms and houses of the Shia enlisted men, and force them back into an army under officers who abused them and brutalized them. Second problem, practical problem, was we had no place to put them because the barracks were all gone, the bases were gone. The political problem was even more decisive, in my view. The Kurds were very clear, the Kurdish leaders were very clear in telling me that if we called back if the Americans called back Saddam's army, they would secede from Iraq. That would be the breakup of Iraq, which would set off, first of all, a civil war inside of Iraq, and probably a larger regional war where the other Kurdish populations in the countries around Iraq would have gotten involved in trying to support an independent Kurdistan. So there were those political problems, and then there was a third one. Thanks to the wise decision of Grand Ayatollah Sistani, the Shia, who were certainly a majority of the population, were cooperating with the occupation. And the Shia leaders we spoke to about the army were just as clear as the Kurds had been, because they remembered that it was Saddam's army, particularly the Republican Guards, who had slaughtered them by the tens of thousands in the wake of the invasion of Kuwait in 1991. And they said as well, we cannot cooperate with you if you're going to bring back Saddam Hussein's army. So there were very strong political reasons and practical reasons not to recall the army. Then the question was how to build an army. And we did build an army. We didn't do it fast enough. But the army, despite all the problems, despite all the chaos of the last couple of years, the army is still the most respected institution in Iraq. And we said when we built that army that any member of the former army up to the level of colonel can become part of the new army. And in fact, that's what happened. By the time I left, I think we had by that time 3 or 4 battalions, I don't remember. Most of the enlisted men in the new army, they were not conscripts, it was a volunteer army. All of the NCOs and the officers came from the old army. So the argument that the people from the old army, which was implied in your question, had no alternative is simply not true. They could have gone out and started a business. They could have joined the new army. There was no tinge on that. I don't dispute that some of them decided to join the insurgency. Not actually in 2003 and 2004, more likely in 2006 and 2007. But again, this was a decision that was considered, and I think it was the right decision.
ذكرت آية الله العظمى السيستاني وأنه ساعد في بعض الأمور، وكان هناك موضوع يتعلق بصياغة الدستور الجديد للعراق، وكان هناك مفاوضات صعبة تجري بين الأطراف المختلفة. تتحدث بكتابك على أنه كانت مرحلة شديدة التحدي. لم تلتقي السيستاني، لماذا لم تلتقيه شخصيا، وما هو تقييمك للدور الذي لعبه خاصة في المراحل الحرجة خلال تواجدك في العراق؟
Grand Ayatollah Sistani made a decision that he would not meet with any members of the CPA or occupation. I would have been honored to have had an opportunity to meet the Grand Ayatollah, but he did not want to. Now, on the other hand, I had a very intense dialogue with him through intermediaries, various intermediaries. I calculated once that I probably had an exchange of 48 or 49 different messages back and forth, including written letters with the Grand Ayatollah Sistani during the year I was there. So that means we were communicating 3 or 4 times a month. It was a very intense dialogue. My view was that the Grand Ayatollah's vision for Iraq was very similar to the vision that the coalition had for Iraq, which was a democratic or at least representative government of some form, and that within the bounds of what he thought was the appropriate role for a Grand Ayatollah, he was generally helpful in realizing that dream. So I had great respect, and I have great respect for Grand Ayatollah Sistani, and I felt that we had a very open and free dialogue with each other that was very helpful to me.
شخصية أخرى هو تيار أيضا من يقود تيار المهدي بزعامة السيد مقتدى الصدر. في كتابك تتحدث وأحيانا بأسى بالغ حول كيفية التعاطي والتعامل مع السيد مقتدى الصدر. طبعا هو أثبت جدارته كقوة سياسية مؤثرة في العراق الآن، استطاع التمثل بعدد من المقاعد في البرلمان، بعض الوزراء في حكومة رئيس الوزراء نوري المالكي. كنت قد طلبت باعتقاله، بإلقاء القبض عليه واعتقاله، وأن يتم إلحاق الهزيمة بجماعته، ولكن كل هذه المحاولات باءت بالفشل، بما فيها محاولة ذكرتها في كتابك حول أن بعض القيادات العسكرية الأمريكية حالت دون القيام بذلك. هل تعتقد أن تقديرك لهذا الأمر كان خاطئا بكيفية التعاطي مع مقتدى الصدر في ذلك الوقت، وبنفس الوقت أيضا أحد أشكال فشل التعامل مع الوضع بالعراق هو أن لا يتم التعامل مع حالات مماثلة مثل هذه الحالات؟
Here's the problem with Muqtada al-Sadr. First of all, I was not trying to arrest him. It was an Iraqi magistrate who issued a warrant for his arrest for involvement in the assassination of Ayatollah al-Khoy when he returned to Baghdad from London on April 10th, 2003. The Iraqi magistrate had investigated the case, had issued an arrest warrant. The Iraqi police were prepared to carry out the arrest warrant and arrest him. We got involved because the Iraqi police said they wanted some military, coalition military, to provide perimeter security in the outer perimeter, outside, away from Muqtada's residence, so that the police could go in, because they didn't know how many people might resist the execution of this Iraqi arrest warrant. One of the principles of good government is the rule of law. My view was that Iraq had lived without the rule of law. It had lived under the rule of one man, Saddam Hussein, for far too long. We wanted a credible justice system, and one of the principles of the rule of law is all people are equal. And I had my legal assistants examine the evidence that the Iraqi magistrate was using for the arrest warrant, read through the affidavits, interview the people involved. Their conclusion was that this was a legitimate arrest warrant based on convincing evidence that Muqtada had been involved in this murder. So my position was, whoever he is and whoever anybody is, we are trying to introduce the rule of law. An Iraqi judge under Iraqi law had issued a legitimate arrest warrant. He asked for our help, or the police asked for our help, in providing perimeter security so that they could carry out the arrest warrant. That didn't happen, as you mentioned. I think it's clear in the period since then that Muqtada has become a more responsible political actor in the Iraqi political context. As you pointed out, he has seats in parliament. His party has, at least till now, supported the government there. So let's see what happens. Again, the situation I was dealing with was a different situation than there is today.
سنأخذ فاصلا قليلا ونتابع الحوار أعزائي المشاهدين. فاصل قصير وسنتابع هذا الحوار مع سعادة السفير بول بريمر.